Today, we're going to deconstruct a really powerful argument in favor of military action against Iran. It's a case laid out by former House Judiciary Counsel Julian Epstein, and it's all built around one single, pretty provocative idea. So let's get right into it.
Heroic. That single word is the absolute foundation of his entire argument. It's not just saying the action is necessary, it's framing it as morally right. So the big question is, how exactly does he justify a claim that strong? Let's break down his logic.
Here's the roadmap for how we'll walk through it. We're going to start with his core claim about heroic action. Then, we'll dig into how he defines the threat from Iran, his critique of past policies, why he says this is the only option left, and finally his pretty optimistic vision for what he calls a new dawn.
All right, so first up, let's really unpack that central claim. The kind of language Epstein chooses to use here, it isn't just supportive, it's almost reverent.
I mean, just look at the framing here. Words like heroic, courageous, he even suggests it could be worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize. This elevates the whole thing way beyond simple military strategy. He's arguing it's a profound moral good that is, in his words, very, very long overdue. You know, when you set the stage like that, you're setting an incredibly high bar for the evidence you've got to bring.
To justify a heroic action, you first need a villain. And in Epstein's argument, there's no question who that is. He paints the Iranian regime as this incredibly complex and, frankly, existential threat.
And listen, this next part is absolutely critical to his entire case. He says this isn't the start of a new war. Instead, it's a response to a war that he claims Iran has been waging against the United States since 1979. See how that just completely reframes the whole context? It shifts the narrative from aggression to long overdue self-defense.
And he gets pretty specific about what this ongoing war looks like. He breaks it down into three parts. First, the nuclear threat, this decades-long push for a bomb. Second, their ballistic missile capability, which he says is powerful enough to overwhelm defensive systems like Israel's Iron Dome. And third, sponsoring what he calls surrogate armies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, to basically export terrorism all over the world.
Now, to really drive home just how severe he thinks this threat is, he makes this incredibly powerful comparison. By drawing a direct line to Adolf Hitler, Epstein frames the Iranian regime not just as some geopolitical rival, but as a uniquely evil force. And from that perspective, well, there's just no room left to negotiate.
So, the natural question is, if the threat is this bad, why hasn't it been dealt with sooner? Well, Epstein's answer is a blistering critique of past attempts at diplomacy, which he basically calls a complete and utter failure.
He paints a really stark contrast here. He dismisses the Obama-Biden approach as hopelessly naive, an appeasement strategy led by what he calls contemporary Neville Chamberlains. I mean, that's a direct shot, comparing them to the failed diplomacy with Hitler before World War II. On the other hand, he frames the Trump approach as one that finally takes the threat seriously and refuses to be, in his own words, played as chumps.
And his prime example for this is the Iran nuclear deal. He argues that as soon as Iran got those pallets of cash from sanctions relief, it didn't moderate its behavior one bit. Nope. He claims that immediately doubled down on their proxy wars, which to him proves that diplomacy was just pointless.
So all of this brings us to the real core of his argument, the justification for shifting away from diplomacy and towards military force. How does he defend that against all the legal and procedural challenges?
Well, when it comes to the whole legal debate over needing Congress's approval, Epstein just dismisses it as a non-starter. He points to the 26,000 bombs he says the Obama administration dropped in a single year and argues that no one was making a peep about the War Powers Act back then. So for him, it's an inconsistently applied rule and basically irrelevant here.
So his case really has multiple layers. He's arguing the action is legally sound, it's morally righteous, and it's strategically necessary. It's framed as the absolute last resort, right? The only option left after sanctions and international oversight and even partial strikes all failed to stop what he calls the regime's maniacal will.
Okay, so finally, let's look at where Epstein thinks this all leads. His vision for the outcome isn't one of chaos or a forever war, but of a really dramatic and positive transformation for Iran and for the whole region. And central to this whole optimistic vision is what he claims about the Iranian people themselves. He estimates that 80 to 90% of them are desperate to get rid of the ruling mullahs. So he contends this isn't an action against the people, it's an action for the people.
And this really gets to the heart of his endgame. He truly believes the U.S. and its allies won't be seen as invaders, but as liberators. He envisions freeing a highly educated, pro-Western population that just wants to reclaim its glorious past.
And the ultimate result, in his view, it's nothing less than the most significant realignments of power in the Middle East in our lifetime. He's predicting the fall of the regime and its replacement with a pro-Western democratic government which would change the entire geopolitical map for the better.
Epstein's argument presents a pretty stark choice, and it's all built on the premise that every non-military option is exhausted and was naive from the start. It really forces us to think about a fundamental question. When you decide diplomacy has completely failed, what path is left?